Hello again, and welcome to part 3 of our ongoing series on economics. In our last lesson, we had been discussing the coinage of gold and silver and our present-day copper-nickel token coinage. I've set up the poster that displays the gold, silver, and the copper-nickel tokens for a very brief review. We remember that the Scriptures had commanded that we would have a perfect and just weight and a perfect and just measure. It's quite evident that within each respective system, at least within the gold coinage and within the silver coinage, a semblance of just weights and measures does prevail. In fact, within the gold system, just weights and measures, precise just weights and measures, did prevail. There was a slight error, you remember, in the silver coinage, where the 2 halves, 4 quarters, 10 dimes did not add up to the same weight as a $1 weight of silver. However, when we look at the copper-nickel tokens, there is no semblance of just weights and measures whatsoever. A 5-cent piece is considerably more metal than the 10-cent piece. And the 100-cent piece is considerably less metal than the 50-cent piece. So we have obviously violated the law of just weights and measures. We, however, did violate the law of just weights and measures between the silver and the gold as early as 1792 with the original Coinage Act, when we created a weight, a large, and a small. And this has caused, I'm going to say, irreparable harm in America, where the average American, even to this day, believes that a dollar is a tangible thing. If these coins had been weighed in ounces, who would be willing to accept the proposition that this coin weighs an ounce and that this coin weighs an ounce? But nevertheless, we have a great deal of confusion, and I hope that we haven't unnecessarily emphasized the weights and measures clause and the coinage of our early gold and silver. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 1 tells us that a false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. Proverbs 16:11 confirms the importance of just weights and measures. Proverbs 16:11 tells us that a just weight and balance are the Lord's, and the weights of the bag are his work. New American Standard in this particular passage says that the weights of the bag are his concern. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 10. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 10. Diverse weights and diverse measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord, or to Yahweh God. And Proverbs 20 and verse 23. Diverse weights are an abomination unto the Lord, and a false balance is not good. We can see that at least King Solomon in the Proverbs thought that just weights and measures was important. We remember how important our ancestors thought it was in the Coinage Act, where they prescribed the death penalty for tampering with it, although they themselves tampered with it slightly between the gold and the silver system. Jeremiah chapter 32. In Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 9 and 10, we see where Jeremiah is purchasing land from Hanamel. It says in verse 9, "And I bought the field of Hanamel, my uncle's son, that was in Anathoth, and weighed him the money, even 17 shekels of silver." And we have 3 indicia. The word indicia is I-N-D-I-C-I-A. 3 elements, or 3 indicia. We have the quantity symbol, 17, the unit of measure, shekel, and the substance being measured, silver. In fact, if you turn over with me to Numbers chapter 7, in Numbers chapter 7 we have numerous references which separate the quantity symbol, the unit of measure, and the substance being weighed or measured. For example, in Numbers chapter 7 and verse 13, we see that his offering was 1 silver charger. The weight thereof was 130 shekels, 1 silver bowl of 70 shekels, after the shekel of the sanctuary. Let's back up for just a moment and dissect these. His offering was 1 silver charger. The New American Standard renders charger a plate. So we have the shape, which is a plate. The object is made out of a precious metal called silver. The weight of it was 130 shekels. So we have all three elements. We have the quantity symbol, 130, the unit of weight measurement, which is shekel, and the substance, which is silver, and the shape of that silver was a charger. One silver bowl of 70 shekels. What's the object? Silver. What's the shape? Bowl. What's the weight? 70 shekels. 70, quantity symbol, shekels, unit of weight, silver, which is the entity being delivered. You need at least three elements, or three indicia, in order to be able to make accurate delivery of anything. And the beauty of using gold and silver as money is that you can actually introduce a fourth element, and that is the purity. You can regulate the purity of gold and silver unlike any other substance. It's very difficult to regulate the purity of cows. It might be a very fatty cow, it might have a lot of gristle in it, it might be a very lean cow, it might have a lot of water. Very difficult to regulate the purity of fish, or even of, many other types of products. But gold and silver, you can regulate the purity, so you can actually have four indicia when using those substances. Numbers chapter 7 and verse 14. Here's another offering substance. 1 spoon of 10 shekels of gold. How many indicia? 3. Quantity symbol 10. Shekels, which is the unit of weight measurement, so there's your second element. And gold is the substance being delivered. Verse 19. He offered for his offering 1 silver charger, the weight whereof was 130 shekels. 1 silver bowl of 70 shekels. Well, there we have all three indicia being used once again. We notice, for example, in verse 25 and 26, a repeat, where the offering substance is silver, the shape would be a charger, the weight would be 130 shekels. In verse 26, we have a golden spoon of 10 shekels full of incense. Verse 31 and 32 confirm this. Verse 37 and 38. Verse 43 and 44. Verse 49 and 50. Verse 55 and 56. Verse 61 and 62. Verse 67 and 68. Verse 73 and 74. Verse 79 and 80. And verse 85 and 86. All three elements, or all three indicia, are being used for offering substances in the sanctuary. Now, if you turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17, 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 5 and verse 7, and we'll see that the Israelites of old not only weighed gold and silver in shekels, but they also weighed other metals such as iron and brass. 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 5. And here's where David goes out to fight and ultimately slay Goliath. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head. This would be the Philistine, Goliath. He had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. This would be the armor. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. Verse 7. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. How many indicia? 3. Quantity symbol, 600. Unit of measure, shekel. And shekel is a unit of weight measurement in particular. And the object that's being weighed or measured is the iron. Can you imagine going out and saying that he had a helmet of brass upon his head and the weight of the coat of mail was $5,000? Yet we could very easily have done that in America if we had used the decimal system to weigh gold and silver. There's no reason why we couldn't weigh iron, brass, tuna, Hamburg, and so forth. We could have weighed that in the decimal system as well. We chose not to. We chose to weigh only gold and silver in coin form in the decimal system. Take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 14 for just a moment. 2 Samuel chapter 14, and we see in verse 26 another instance of something being weighed in a unit of measure called shekel. It says here in verse 26, and when he polled his head, for it was at every year's end that he polled it, because the hair was heavy upon him, therefore he polled it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels, after the king's weight. Can you imagine weighing your hair in dollars? But you certainly could weigh the hair in dollars if you wanted to use the decimal or metric system to weigh hair. The United States, however, just chose to use the metric system or the decimal system to weigh gold and silver in its coin. And nowhere else was it going to use the decimal system for weight measurement. And if you look at the coinage of all of the foreign countries, you'll find that they've all adopted a unit of measure that is unique relative to all of the other units of measure. For example, they might have a metric system where they're going to weigh things in grams, kilograms, and so forth in France, in England, Germany, and elsewhere. And yet when it came to weighing their gold and silver, they each adopted a completely different system of weight measurement to weigh gold and silver. It might have been Deutschmark, it might have been franc, it might have been pound, it might have been shilling. In the Orient, they might have weighed their precious metals in yens. And eventually, when we took away the precious metals, we were still using the units of measure called yen, Deutschmark, mark, and franc, etc. But we're not weighing anything in those units of measure. And we've converted those units of measure into tangible things in our own minds. And it's purely a fiction. We've been very good at living in this, what F. Tupper Saucy calls idea sphere. So let's do a real quick review of the last two lessons. Money is a non-tangible. No one can see, hear, smell, taste, or touch a money, any more than you can touch a furniture. You can have something used as furniture, such as a table, a chair, a lamp, a bed, but there's no such thing in and of itself that is a furniture. Likewise, there's no such thing in and of itself that is a money. But something can be used as money. And in the United States, gold and silver in coin form were ordained by law to be used as money. And the United States Constitution still prescribes gold and silver coin to be used as a tender in payment of debts by every state. And if your state isn't paying its debts in gold and silver, then your state is in violation of the law. Now, gold and silver need a unit of weight measurement, and dollar became that unit of measure. But there are no circulating gold and silver coins, except a few of us who use gold and silver, but by and large there's no gold and silver in circulation. So what we have now is a system which works only with credit. It works with no substance. It doesn't work with gold, silver, copper, and it doesn't even work with paper. Now, many people are going to insist that we have a paper money system, and that statement is made over and over again by people who really ought to know better. Paper is too heavy to be used as money. If you wanted to purchase a house or a new motor home or an airplane in paper, it would take an awful lot of paper, toilet paper or paper towels, or even stationery typewriter paper, to purchase a house. The numbers on Federal Reserve notes or checks do not have any connection whatsoever with a quantity of paper on deposit in any warehouse, anywhere. And no one is under obligation to deliver you a quantity of paper that's measured in dollars and cents. What we have is intangible credit being used as if it were money. And in a credit system, we don't need three elements or three indicia. There's nothing that's being used as money in the United States or as a medium of exchange, which is why I don't anticipate too many letters from people who want to receive 100 pounds of this free money, because what we're using as money in America is credit. And 100 pounds of credit is very difficult to spend. Credit is a non-tangible. It comes from the Latin word credere, which means to believe. And after all, if you go to a store and you ask someone to extend you credit so that you could purchase a new clock, and we needed a new clock here a little while ago in the studio, but I'm not going to pay for it today, I'm going to buy it a little bit later, I want to pay for it later on, I want you to extend me credit, you're asking someone to allow you to defer the payment of that clock. And it's the deferment of payment that's what we're using as money in America. And it's a rather abstract and convoluted concept. I'm not sure who really invented it, but nevertheless it seems to be working, and it seems to be working very well. It's been working us out of house and home, and we have a lot of foreclosures and bankruptcies to reflect how well it has been working for us or on us. But in a monetary system, you need three elements. You need the quantity symbol, the unit of measure, and the thing being weighed or measured. In a credit system, there is no thing being weighed or measured. Therefore, you don't need to identify the third element, which is the entity being weighed or measured, because there is none. And therefore, you don't need a unit of weight measurement either. And if you've ever noticed, when you go to the bank and make a deposit, I hope you don't do business with those institutions, but if you're still sinning, you notice that when you enter your deposit ticket or submit it to the bank, your deposit ticket will have a dollar sign on it. The deposit receipt that you will receive will bear the same number as the number is on your deposit ticket. But if your bank was like the bank I used to do business with, there's no dollar sign. They do not acknowledge receipt of any dollars of anything because there's nothing on deposit in a bank. If you've received a tax statement recently, perhaps a property tax assessment, if it's like the Vernon County tax assessments, which come out in the state of Missouri, they do not use a dollar sign on their tax statements. If you owe a tax of $500 of whatever the money is, and they won't be able to tell you either, there's no dollar sign. It'll just be the number 500. No decimal point, and nothing to a right or to the right of a decimal point, because the decimal point isn't there. It'll just simply say current or present valuation 500. You now have to guess what that 500 means. We live in a country where if you guess wrong, you can spend a long time in jail. What we have taking place in America is the use of banknotes, which are no longer even notes, which are denominated in dollars, but which have replaced somehow the gold and the silver coins we once used. Well, how did that all come to pass? Let's ask the Federal Reserve. Your money in the Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and they tell us on page 4 about the origin of banknotes. And these, by the way, are credit instruments. Federal Reserve notes, United States notes, gold and silver certificates, they were all credit instruments. They were instruments used to defer the payment of the substance, because payment is the delivery of the money. And the money in the United States was to be, and still is, gold and silver in coin form. The United States is on a credit system, as I've mentioned, and I'm going to back up just a little bit, just a moment here. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, in their little booklet entitled Electronic Money and the Payments Mechanism, tells us on page 29, credit is banking stock in trade. I was in the food business at one time, and I could have identified and even eaten most of the stock of our trade. Have you ever seen credit? Can you drop credit on the floor and hear it bounce? Can you tear credit and hear it rip? Can you taste credit? Is it sweet or sour? What is credit? Credit is a privilege, and you cannot see, smell, hear, taste, or touch a privilege. Keeping our money healthy, Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Well, what is it that we're using as money? They'll tell us what the system works with here on page 12. Quote, and you recall, the Federal Reserve System works only with credit. Period. The Federal Reserve System, the economic system of the United States, does not work with money. It hasn't worked with money since 1965 or 1964, and even then it only worked with very little bit of money. They tell us here on page 12 also, quote, credit, you see, is a product that is bought and sold. Thus, borrowers compete in the credit markets for the limited amount available rather than in the marketplace for the limited goods available. Have you rented a little credit recently? If you rent an automobile from Avis or Hertz, you can take a picture of what you rent. Do you think you can take a picture of the credit that you borrowed from a bank? You may think you can. But the instrument that you take a picture of is only the title instrument, or the instrument that conveys title to the credit. Just as a certificate of title may be an evidence of ownership, and it may describe an automobile. You can take a picture of that, but you cannot take a picture of ownership. Likewise, you could take a picture of a Federal Reserve note or a bank check, but you can't take a picture of the money that's on deposit in a bank, because the money that's on deposit in a bank in the United States is only intangible credit, and no one has ever seen, smelled, heard, tasted, or touched credit. In fact, we've been using credit for a rather long time. Back in 1948, when Dodd and Hasek had written their book called Economics, Principles and Applications, they told us in Chapter 11, entitled Money, page 181, quote, "It has been estimated, however, that money is used in only about 10% of all the buying and selling transactions that are carried on in the United States." Did you catch that? Only 10% of all transactions were done in money. What, pray tell, were the other transactions done? And this was written in 1948. The next sentence tells us, quote, "Credit is the device," look that up in your dictionary if you would like, "credit is the device that is used in the great majority of cases." It would appear that credit is used, or was used, in 90% of the cases back when this book was written in 1948. What's the origin then of these banknotes, these Federal Reserve notes? Where'd they come from? Did God send them down to Moses, and then Moses brought them down off Mount Sinai along with the tablets of stone? Where did they come from? Well, we go to Your Money in the Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and they'll tell us the origin of the bank instruments. They tell us on page 4, under the subtitle, "Commercial Banking Begins." Although archaeologists have uncovered stone tablets that apparently served as loan contracts in ancient Babylon, for those of you who are Bible students, you might find that of interest, modern-day banking probably had its start in England. Goldsmiths stored gold and coins for customers as a sideline to their principal trade and issued receipts for the amount. Well, what could be wrong with that? Paul deposits a gold coin with honest Bruno in Jerusalem, and Bruno gives him a receipt for the gold that he's deposited. What's wrong with that? Well, let's see. The article goes on, quote, "In time, depositors of gold found they could settle debts by transferring gold receipts instead of gold itself." You see, apparently Paul discovered that one day the bank was closed in Jerusalem. We have a lot of bank holidays, you know. And he really wanted to buy something on this particular day. In fact, it might have been the Sabbath, and you can argue whether that's Saturday or Sunday or whether the Sabbath floats throughout the year, and you can draw blood yourself on that one. Don't drag me into it. But he decides he really wants something. The bank's closed, so he decides he's going to try to pass the gold receipt. And the merchant says, "Well, what would I want that for?" And Paul says, "Well, this is as good as gold because you can go and get the gold with it, because it's a promise to pay gold." Oh, well, okay, I guess I'll trust you. And you see, it's by our own voluntary consent and our own choice that we circulate debt instruments instead of the gold and silver coins. I hasten to point that out in Economics, Principles and Applications by Dodd and Hasek. They tell us here, for example, on page 185, quote, "Silver coins are still available for use by those who prefer them," end quote. So you see, in 1948, that was correct. And if you didn't prefer to carry that heavy barbaric metal around with you, you might have opted to carry lightweight silver certificates or Federal Reserve notes, or maybe even United States notes. That was by your voluntary choice. And when you use gold and silver, you are, at least in economics, under a system of jurisprudence called, in America, at law. If you choose to use negotiable instruments which come out of the banking system, you operate under what used to be called the law of merchants, or the law merchant, and is today called commercial law. And commercial law binds you to a separate system of jurisprudence, which is not law, but is equity. history of banking in all the leading nations also tells us something about this free choice as to whether or not we're going to use these pieces of paper with numbers on them or that barbaric metal that the people who issue these tell us we shouldn't want to bother carrying. Yet for some reason or other they wanted us to deposit those barbaric metals with them. Page 178, and this is again volume 2 of A History of Banking, published in 1896. Quote, "It lies with the customer to determine whether he will circulate these credits by notes or checks, and not with the banker." End quote. See, your free choice to use checks and notes. Nobody came to you with a gun, held it to your head, and said, "You must use these things." You may think they did, but I've never known it to have been done, at least not in recent years. Let's take a peek at these Federal Reserve notes as we go through this particular book, Your Money in the Federal Reserve System, from the Minneapolis Fed. In time, it says here, depositors of gold found they could settle debts by transferring gold receipts instead of gold itself. This is a gold receipt. Follow through. Federal Reserve note. It's issued by the Federal Reserve Bank. In this particular case, it's issued by the First District. The First District, or the first letter of the alphabet, is the letter A. The First District is the Boston Fed, and therefore we have these little numbers 1. These are the First District. If these had been issued by the the New York Federal Reserve Bank, that's the Second District. We'd have little numbers 2 down here on the bill. And the second letter of the alphabet is B, so the letter B would appear. If they were San Francisco Fed, that's the 12th district, so we'd have the little number 12 in these little corners here. And we would have the letter, what, L, the 12th letter of the alphabet inside the seal. Federal Reserve note. A note, by definition, according to Black's Law Dictionary, and they'll cite the Uniform Commercial Code at 3-104 Part 1, is an absolute and unconditional promise by the maker or the drawee to pay a sum certain of money to the bearer or to someone else, a specified person, at a specified time or on demand. Notes are promises to pay money. They're not promises to pay oranges. Notes pay money or promise to pay money if they're good notes, and they don't pay the money if they're not good notes. Now, there's a contract on this note, and we'll begin the contract at the top by reading the sentence, "The United States of America." Now, the sentence isn't over yet. What's the United States of America going to do? Well, by definition, a note is a promise by the maker or the drawee to pay a sum certain of money. So the United States somehow is being held liable to make payment. I don't know why that is, because these notes are issued by a private corporation called the Federal Reserve. Yet the Federal Reserve has made the United States of America liable for the payment of the notes. The United States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $10. Well, that's incomplete. We only have 2 indicia that have been used. The quantity symbol 10 and the unit of weight measurement in the decimal system called dollars. Now, dollars only are used to weigh gold and silver. So we must continue the sentence somewhere. Well, we continue up to the left of the portrait, and they'll tell us, redeemable in gold, on demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. And there's the period at the end of the word bank. That's the only punctuation that we have in the entire sentence. Now, most people who handle these notes never realized that there was a contract written on them. The reason I suspect they didn't notice is because part of the contract was written in large black letters, another portion of the contract was written in very skinny white letters, another portion of the contract was written in fat white letters, and then another portion of the contract was written in very tiny solid black letters. 1, 2, 3, 4 type styles have been used to write the sentence. And there was even a pretty picture that was inserted partway through the sentence to break up the continuity. That's very deceptive. And that, I believe, is why, for the main part, The average American never realized that there was a contract on that instrument. Now, if it's a promise to pay gold, obviously this piece of paper can't be gold. If it's a promise to pay lawful money, it obviously cannot be, in and of itself, lawful money. A promise to pay a hat can't be a hat. A promise to pay a Ford automobile cannot be a Ford automobile. And a promise to pay gold or lawful money cannot be gold or lawful money in and of itself. It's only a piece of paper. It's redeemable in gold on demand, it said. And a note by definition. Now take out Black's Law Dictionary right now, and we'll look up the word note. Note, a noun. An instrument containing an express and absolute promise of the signer. Well, we've got some signers down here. One's the Treasurer of the United States, and another one is the Secretary of the Treasury. Well, those are government officials. Yet the instrument is issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which is a private company. It is printed by the United States Treasury, but this Treasury seal over here is merely the seal of the print shop. It's issued by this particular institution called the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. A note, by definition, is an instrument containing an express and absolute promise of signer, in other words, the maker, to pay to specified person or order or bearer a definite sum of money at a specified time. That they cite from the Uniform Commercial Code at Section 3-104, Subpart 1. The Uniform Commercial Code is commercial law, in what used to be called the law of merchants. Let's read from the Boston, I keep calling it the Boston Fed, I don't know, I guess I've got a little bit of a hang-up today. Let's read from Your Money in the Federal Reserve System, the Minneapolis Fed, again on page 4, where it said that in time depositors of gold found they could settle debts by transferring gold receipts instead of gold itself. What would be wrong with that? Paul delivers me a gold coin, and I give him a receipt, and he spends the receipt as if it were the gold coin. What could be wrong with that? After all, if he wants to come back and get the gold coin, he can simply bring the certificate back, or whoever he passes the piece of paper to can bring it in, and I'll give him the gold. Well, one of the problems is that we now have a purchasing unit in the marketplace which is not the money itself. We have only one purchasing unit in the marketplace. That's the receipt for the gold. The gold coin is currently on deposit. But people are treating the receipt as if it were just as good as the real thing. This leads to additional confusion and will exacerbate the problem. The article goes on, quote, goldsmiths soon discovered that part of the money left with them was never withdrawn, end quote. What was the money that was never withdrawn? The piece of paper? No. It was the gold coin that wasn't withdrawn. People found that if they could pass pieces of paper with numbers on them, they were certainly lighter, perhaps a little bit more convenient than carrying a heavier gold coin. They didn't bother to come after the gold anymore. The article goes on, quote, they, that'd be the banker, could loan it, that was the gold coin, to other persons who would repay later with interest. Uh-oh, another scriptural no-no. We're starting to make loans at interest. But we see now that the gold coin that was supposed to be on deposit to back and also redeem the piece of paper was now being loaned out and being used or spent in the marketplace. How many purchasing units do we have in the marketplace now? 2. The receipt for the gold coin and the gold coin. What happens to the price of commodities in the marketplace if we increase the purchasing units, real or imaginary purchasing units? Prices tend to rise, and this phenomena we today call inflation, or at least most people call it inflation. Where does inflation come from? From instruments which are being used as if they were the money, circulating alongside or being used instead of the money. And those all come from the banks. Furthermore, the article goes on, the borrowers found it convenient to accept receipts for the amount of their loans rather than actual gold. If Paul, who is the depositor, deposits a gold coin and I then give him a receipt and he spends the receipt in the marketplace as if it were the gold coin, then it would stand to reason if I could loan Paul's gold coin to someone else, like Fred over here, Then maybe I'll tell Fred, you don't want to borrow that heavy barbaric metal. Well, it's going to wear out your pockets and it'll wear out your socks. You know, you'd be kind of coming down heavy on that side because you got all the heavy barbaric metal. Let me save your socks and your pockets. You carry one of my lightweight, convenient receipts. After all, if it's good enough for a depositor, it's good enough for a borrower. So Fred takes one of my receipts and he says, well, how do I know it's good? Well, you just turn it back in here and I'll give you gold for it. How's that if you don't trust me? Oh, okay, I trust you, I trust you. And he begins using the receipt as well. We now have the depositor and the borrower now both using receipts against the same gold coin. And who do you think kept the gold coin? Honest Bruno, your friendly banker. And please do call me by my first name. The phenomena of inflation is created by credit instruments, and credit instruments are circulated wildly by the banking community. Now the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy 19:15 and Matthew 18:16 that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a matter be established. So we go to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, which puts out a little publication entitled Modern Money Mechanics. Now, if you want to order one of these publications, they're free of charge. Don't worry about the postage. The Federal Reserve gets the postage for nothing. The least they can do is give you a free book. If they stole it from you, if you're a producer, the least they can do is give you a free booklet to tell you what a wonderful job they're doing. This is an older issue. I could have brought a new one, but I happen to have this one underlined. Your new ones will be a light blue, a solid light blue color and dark blue. And on page 3, they tell us, quote, banks can build up deposits by increasing loans. Did you know that? I'm a rather simple individual. I come from the rural state of Maine, and I know what deposits look like. I've seen them out behind the barn. They usually steam out there in the morning. Haven't you seen them? They stand, 6, 8 feet high. Now it says here that banks can build up deposits by increasing loans. But if your neighbor came and borrowed some of that manure deposit that you had out behind your barn, would the deposit go down, stay the same, excuse me, or would the deposit increase? Well, it would have to go down. But that's not what it says here. It says that banks can build up deposits by increasing loans. Can you imagine lending some of the manure and having the deposit actually increase? That's quite a trick. How do they do this? Well, the article goes on. It says here, quote, this unique attribute, and it is indeed unique, of the banking business was discovered several centuries ago. Who do you think discovered it? The depositor, the borrower, or the banker, who was privy to more information than either the depositor or the borrower? At one time, the article goes on, bankers were merely middlemen. And for those of you who still believe that bankers are middlemen, please cast that notion from your mind. Bankers were at one time middlemen. They made, that was past tense, they made a profit by accepting gold and coin, or coins, brought to them for safekeeping and lending them to borrowers. If you think that's what they do today, you're in error. But they soon found that the receipts they issued to depositors were being used as a means of payment. These receipts were acceptable as money, as if they were money, to be more accurate, since whoever held them could go to the banker and exchange them for metallic money. Then bankers discovered that they could make loans merely by giving borrowers their promises to pay, brackets, banknotes. In this way, banks began to create money. More notes could be issued than the gold and coin on hand because only a portion of the notes outstanding would be presented for payment at any one time. Let's look at this a little bit more carefully. Page 4, it says, then bankers discovered they could make loans merely by giving borrowers their promises to pay. Banknotes. And a Federal Reserve note is a banknote. It just happens to be issued by the central bank as opposed to one of your local national banks. But back at the turn of the century, we had between 7,000 and 12,000 banks issuing their own notes as well. They don't do that any longer. They now just issue demand deposits or checks. They write bad checks. The Federal Reserve seems to have a monopoly on writing bad or bogus notes. Can you imagine Avis Rent-A-Car Company doing this? where we go to the rental car agency and we say, I'd like to rent a new car. And they give us a selection and we choose some sort of an import because we can't seem to afford to drive our American cars. We get the keys, we go out to the parking lot and we're looking up and down. We see all these signs that say reserved for Avis, reserved for Avis, reserved for Avis, but no cars. They must be all in the maintenance garage or in another lot. So we go back and we say, excuse me, Bill, I can't find the car. Oh, he says, there isn't one. What do you mean there isn't one? You promised to lend me a car and I've got to catch a flight out of Omaha and I need the car to get there. You promised to lend me the car. That's right, he says, that's what we loaned you. You loaned me what? We loaned you the promise. You see, he says, we found it was a lot cheaper that way. Yes, I think I can understand that. Banks don't lend money. They lend promises to lend money. They pretend to make the loan. And we go right along with them and pretend we got it. But if you can identify what the bank lends to you that's expressed in dollars and cents, that's current as money, I'll give you 100 pounds of that. Absolutely free. Gosh, we must be up to 300 pounds by now. By the time this video is over, you're probably going to be able to claim 1,000 pounds of free money. In this way, banks began to create money. How did they create money? By issuing more notes than there was money. But what is a note? A note, by definition, is an absolute and unconditional promise by the maker or the drawee to pay a sum certain of money. And yet they tell us right here on page 4, in black and white, and this is a revised issue. This happens to have been revised in June 1975. It first came out in 1961. This was the third revision. But they tell us right in here, quote, more notes, more absolute and unconditional promises to pay money, could be issued than the gold and coin, the money, on hand. Is that honest? Is that lawful? Can you show me a law that authorizes them to do this? When all states have bad check laws and bad negotiable instrument law, here the banks are admitting that they do this on a regular basis. And they say they create money. Actually, banks don't create money. You do. If you go to a bank and take a loan and believe you got it, if you believe you got it, you created the money in your own mind. Let's take a peek again at this particular Federal Reserve note. This was a 1928 series. Now, we could have gone back to 1914 series notes because the Federal Reserve was created by Congressional Act in 1913. It's a private company, which many people seem to think is a big deal. Actually, it's not, because what they're doing wouldn't be any better if the government was doing it. Theft is theft. It doesn't make any difference if it's being done by President Reagan. Just because it's a private company doesn't mean that in and of itself is wrong. But theft is definitely wrong. But this particular note said that it was redeemable in gold. The fact of the matter is, Federal Reserve notes were never redeemable in gold. Now, Federal Reserve notes such as this one here back in 1928 and earlier series Federal Reserve notes, could have claimed some of the gold, but remember the Federal Reserve had told us in Modern Money Mechanics that banks issue more notes than there is money. And the only way you can have redemption of notes is that every note will claim the substance at par. In other words, a $10 Federal Reserve note must claim a $10 weight of gold, which is 258 grains. But if you've got more notes than there is gold, then you don't have redemption. You can merely exchange a few of the notes to get the gold and hope that not everybody comes in to get them all at once. I bet you thought Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This happens to be the second edition, 1980. There are later editions and they have done some changes, so be wary of the changes in the wording. But this is a second edition, 1980. They tell us here, for example, that on page 29, quote, when the Federal Reserve was established, Congress required the 12 reserve banks to back their currency. Hold on just a moment. Is this currency or is it a currency note? And is a currency note currency? Is it money or is it a money note? And is a money note money? Actually, it's not currency, it's a currency note. Or at least it was an attempt to be a currency note. So there's a slight error here. When the Federal Reserve was established, Congress required the 12 reserve banks to back their currency with 40% gold and 100% eligible paper. Hey, that's great. That's 140% backing. Well, not quite. Eligible paper, they tell us here, means short-term IOUs of businesses and farmers. In other words, Federal Reserve notes were backed with 100% IOUs. What is a note by definition? It's an IOU. If you look up IOU in any dictionary, you'll find that an IOU and a note both have the same definition. It's an acknowledgement of debt. So this acknowledgement of debt is backed with 100% acknowledgements of debt. That's like backing your check with another check. It's good business. I'd like to be able to do that if I weren't Christian. They were backed with 40% gold. Is that good? Not very. That's sort of like opening up an airline and selling tickets. And then as the gate attendant is letting the people on board the airplane, he lets about 40 people on, and then he starts turning away the rest of us. Being one of those who's turned away but yet has purchased his ticket, I go to the gate attendant and I say, "Gibbs, you turned away more people than you let on the plane." "Yes, sir," he says, we're overbooked." "How many seats on the airplane?" 40. "Well, how many tickets did you sell?" 100. "You stupid fools, you're going to have to refund 60 tickets. "No, sir," he says, "those are non-refundable tickets." "How's business?" "Fantastic." Why buy 100-seat airplanes when 40-seat airplanes will do? Congress authorized the Federal Reserve to do basically the same thing. They authorized the Federal Reserve to open their doors and with $40 of the money on deposit, write promises to pay $100 of the money. That's very profitable. Because with the extra 60, you can steal the equivalent of $60 of gold value in the production and the labor of the people who are working for the IOUs that will never pay. That's like opening up a checking account, putting $40 in the account, and writing a check for $100, and I, the banker, will tell you, "I'll clear the full amount. Would you like to do that?" It's amazing, you know. You ask people in an audience, excuse me, sir, if I let you open up a checking account with my bank, and you put $40 in the account, and I'll clear your checks for the full amount of $100. Would you like to do that? A lot of people are confused. But a lot of our people are really so basically honest, they can't think like a crook. And it's difficult to comprehend this fraud because we just don't think the same way as the minds of the people who put this together, if you can call some of them people. So the Federal Reserve, from the very beginning, when it was created in 1913 and opened its doors in 1914, began with only 40% backing of its instruments, which simply means that a $10 Federal Reserve note only had $4 in gold to redeem it. I'd like to be able to write $10 checks and only have $4 in the account and be able to get away with a $10 check, wouldn't you? That'd be pretty profitable. In 1920, the United States had its first scientifically planned depression, at least the scientifically created depression by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve itself, we should point out, was created out of necessity. You see, in around 1907 or thereabouts, Morgan Guarantee and Trust and a few other banks apparently had some problems, which problems they created in and of themselves. They made some loans. They weren't charging maybe an awful lot for the interest on their loans, but they wanted to get people in debt, get people into the system. And then the president of Morgan Guarantee and Trust contacted all of his branch managers shortly thereafter and said, "I want you to close on about 1/3 or 1/2 of all the outstanding loans." What for? Because I told you to. Well, when you start calling on loans, you put an awful strain on the economy, especially the people who have done the borrowing. And a person who has all of his funds, money, he may have even borrowed some money, most likely he borrowed credit, however, he's got it all tied up in a tangible, like a house. It's very difficult to convert a house into instant cash. You don't do that overnight. And consequently, values of real estate began to plummet as more and more people began putting for sale signs out in front of their homes. The market wasn't very good at all. The bankers then used this as an excuse to go to Congress to lobby for a central bank, which they themselves were going to operate, which would have unlimited power of issuance of what they called an elastic currency. An elastic currency is a very sophisticated name for a rubber check and rubber notes. That's what they call them. In 1929, we ended up with a second scientifically created depression of the Federal Reserve, because now they're able to operate the throttle of the economy directly and control the entire country instead of just segments of the economy, as Morgan Guarantee and Trust was able to do. They had created vast amounts of fraudulent loans by loaning notes and checks and other negotiable instruments issued against nothing. And it's very easy to loan nothing, and you don't have to charge very much on loans of nothing. And later on, as people got further and further in debt, the banking system then had a change of policy. And they started raising the interest rates and the reserve requirements that commercial banks had to maintain. And the economy began to falter. The Federal Reserve didn't provide a lot more rubber checks this time. Now, it didn't provide the elastic currency that they promised that they would, but rather foreclosed on some of the local banks, and the local banks were in turn foreclosing on some of the farmers and the businessmen. And a great cataclysmic event took place in 1929. We went from many, many hundreds, perhaps even thousands of automobile manufacturers, even airplane and aircraft engine manufacturers, down to the big three and the big four. There were a lot of mergers that took place at that time, and we see a lot of mergers taking place once again. But the consolidations and the monopolies have been secured with each and every one of these cyclical ups and downs, managed depressions. So the Depression of 1929 was used as a scapegoat to convince the public that gold was somehow the problem, and that if we simply took the gold away from the people, we could resolve the problem by somehow stabilizing the dollar. I guess that's sort of like taking the hamburger away from the people to stabilize the pound. So in 1934, the Federal Reserve issued another series of notes to replace the former notes, which were redeemable in gold, because by House Joint Resolution 192, it was now considered to be against public policy for the people to pay their debts in gold. The new contracts on the new notes, since we're not going to use gold anymore, must eliminate the word gold. So, Federal Reserve note, the United States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $10. $10 of what? It goes on. This note is legal tender for all debts public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. Period. Oh, there's even a comma up there after the word Treasury. In fact, there's one up there too. The note is legal tender. A note is an absolute and unconditional promise to pay the money. Legal, by definition, is the form of law. Lawful is the substance of law. And for those of you who have studied the subject of law, you know that substance governs over form. Legal is the form of law, and tender is a verb which means to offer. So this note, or this absolute and unconditional promise to pay money, is a formalistic offer to pay the money for all debts public and private, and is redeemable in the lawful substance of law, money, at the United States Treasury or any Federal Reserve Bank. What is lawful money? Because if this is redeemable in lawful money, it cannot be lawful money in and of itself. Lawful money was defined in Title 12 of the United States Code to be, quote, the terms lawful money or lawful money of the United States shall be construed to mean gold or silver coin of the United States. If you remember when we were looking at the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792, we had read about what was going to be the lawful tender. And in Section 16 of the Coinage Act, April 2nd, 1792, told us, quote, that all the gold and silver coins shall be a lawful tender in all payments whatsoever. It didn't say they'd be a legal tender. Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 1 says that no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. And in order to pay debts, you must deliver the money. To deliver a promise to pay the money is not the delivery of the money itself. That's a discharge or a deferment of the payment. The payment only comes when you deliver the gold and silver. Well, if lawful money is gold or silver, and you can't have gold anymore because that seemed to have been outlawed by some House joint resolution, and resolutions aren't law, by the way. If you check that in Black's Law Dictionary, the word resolution. What was the lawful money you were supposed to be able to get for this instrument? Silver. Silver was the only lawful money substance that was left. So this particular Federal Reserve note had to be a claim on a $10 weight of silver. Well, how much is that? That would have been 4,125 grains of 90% pure silver. Because a dollar weight of silver is 412.5 grains of 0.900 fine silver. That worked out to about, what, 371.25 grains of pure silver. 412.5 grains per dollar weight. So therefore we have 4,125 grains of silver that had to be paid on this instrument if this instrument was going to be redeemable. Now this particular instrument was issued by the 7th District. The 7th letter of the alphabet is the letter G. The 7th District is the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank, so we have the 7th District and the number 7 appearing in the corner of the bills. In 1950, they changed the notes again. In fact, if you notice, I better put these things up together. Can we get both of these together? We notice that the 1950 series note reads verbatim, word for word, what the 1934 series note read. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. If it's a promise to pay money, it cannot be the money in and of itself, yet they went from 4 lines large print down to 3 lines small print. Why did they do that? Are they trying to save ink? Or are they trying to get us to overlook the promise of redemption? When we come back from our next break, we will examine this particular concept a little further and how the promise of redemption was removed from subsequent notes and what implications this all has. For after all, the average person will say, what difference does it make? I can go get my groceries with these Federal Reserve notes. The system works just as it did before. If there was no difference, we wouldn't be conducting this series of videotapes. It would all just be academic. The implications are very serious, and we'll be discussing that in lesson number 4 and subsequent lessons. Please join us, won't you? Thank you. Let's take a break.